Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Michelle Bailat-Jones, and I'm delighted to be here for this conversation between Lisa Appignanesi and Horatio Clare. I'd like to encourage you all, after the session, to look further into their biographies, because I'm only able to mention about the tiniest tip of the iceberg of their accomplishments. Lisa Appignanesi is a British-Canadian writer born in Poland, a journalist and historian. Her many engagements include President of English Pen, Chair of the Royal Society of Literature Council, and Chair of the 2018 Man Booker International Prize. Her multi-award-winning body of work includes numerous novels, essays, and works of nonfiction, notably Memory and Desire, Freud's Women, co-authored with John Forrester, a critically acclaimed memoir, Losing the Dead, and Everyday Madness, which was published in 2018. Her incredible work, Mad, Bad, and Sad, published in 2008, analyzes 2 centuries of the treatment of mental disorders in women. Horatio Clare is a critically acclaimed and award-winning Welsh author, journalist, and radio producer. His work encompasses essays and memoir, travel narratives, and nature writing, and he has written for both adults and children. He presented a BBC Radio 4 series called Is Psychiatry Working? Among other books, he is the author of, most recently, in 2025, We Came by Sea, Stories of a Greater Britain, and Down to the Sea in Ships, which won the Stanford Dolman Prize. In 2021, he published the marvelous memoir, Heavy Light, A Journey Through Madness, Mania and Healing, followed in 2024 by what I assume is kind of a companion book to it, Your Journey, Your Way, How to Make the Mental Health System Work for You. So it was a real pleasure preparing for this session today to read into your extensive body of work of these 2 writers, a body of work that has really looked with compassion and curiosity and care at the world around us, at how humans function and how sometimes humans struggle and how they themselves have struggled. And so unfortunately, with our theme today, we're a tiny bit restricted, and we'll be focusing mainly on Mad, Bad, and Sad, Heavy Light, and Everyday Madness. But I'm really looking forward to how their deep knowledge and experience and their sort of general approach to these topics will inform our discussion. So just thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So I would like to open with a line, and this echoes something that we discussed last night for anyone who was here with the session with Patrick Lemoine and Rosa Montero. But there is a line in the introduction to Mad, Bad, and Sad that really struck me, and I thought would be a good entry into your works. And so I read, I have long been aware of the shallowness of sanity.
Do you want me to do a riff?
Yeah.
Well, it's true, and it continues to be even truer than when I wrote it, I think. I think we've all been aware of this, and Patrick mentioned it last night as well, that we spend so much of our lives in a state which isn't the kind of rational, free choice that various forms of recent capitalism have touted to us as the norm of rationality. When you drive, you go into trance, obviously. I find myself occasionally swearing in a way that shames me in front of my children. I don't do this on stage normally, or indeed in everyday domestic life. There are so many instances where your mind leaves you, not even mentioning nights with dreams filling them, but also everyday states like the one I described in Everyday Madness, which is a state of mourning. We've all had people, well, most of us have had people around us die, and you're cast into a state which is not altogether rational or indeed reasonable. It takes you into parts of yourself that you may not have visited before, and you find yourself caught in ambivalences, loves, hatreds, things that aren't familiar to you as part of your rational self-image. So rationality, reason, sanity itself is a very, very shallow state. And sanity means cleanliness as well, which is a strange riff to put on it. But Horatio.
Well, thank you for your introduction, and merci, mesdames, messieurs, for your wonderful welcome. Votre très gentil accueil ici en San Francisco de la Suisse. C'est super d'être ici, c'est très différent de l'Angleterre. Vous avez la confiance ici, un benessere, quoi, vous say in Italian. I come from South Wales, and I live in the north of England, where we are beset by madness. We have very high rates of mental ill health, all for completely rational reasons. If I'd never left London, I wouldn't be here, you know. I'd be writing How Nice to Be Sane. So the madness in English, it comes from the old German Gemeindas, meaning changed for the worse. And if you think of human life as first of all it's warm, and then it's warm with boobs, and then it's teenagerhood, and then in England it's depression, unemployment. You can see that change for the worse is fairly normal. But I do think there are serious questions about how, I teach at the University of Manchester. I have third years. They don't see the point in working 5 days a week to get a pension. They do feel depressed when they read the newspapers and look out the window. And these are rational responses. So a lot of what we would call mental illness, I think, is a completely rational response. And in my journey through it and in researching it, what we came down to really was, when you take away the good reasons for being depressed, what is left? What is this capitalist construction of normality? And I think it is true that we have designed a system which relies on a kind of rationality which is fierce, austere, and very narrow. And I think what is interesting about different psychiatric states, of course, is the true width of the world which is opened to you. Now, whether or not you're supported in that journey and in the natural metamorphosizing of a human soul and mind can be very various. And we know how to help everybody in any situation, but that knowledge and the treatments aren't available generally. We tend to over-medicate and try and dose the whole thing away. But I hope that in the future, what now is seen as mad will be seen as completely normal. I mean, clearly the madness is the system under which most of us live.
Can I just add to this?
Please.
Because with my historian's hat on, I did an awful lot of research when I was writing Mad, Bad and Sad. And it became quite clear within that, of course, we now take into the term madness or insanity, or lunacy, as it was once called, many, many more conditions than were once upon a time thought of as falling into that category. And that's a concatenation of various forces, one of which is the rise and rise of medicine. Mind doctors came into being in the course of the 19th century and became a separate profession by the end of that century, and really rose and rose in the 20th. By the time that the century turned, the 20th turned to the 21st, you had even the branches of medicine that were discovered in the cusp of the last century taking on more and more and more diagnostic categories, which seemed to have a reasonable attribution with them. And they included things like depression and many things which were inevitably before thought of as simply the condition of being poor and being deprived, but wasn't something that you would necessarily medicate. You might self-medicate with alcohol, but it wasn't something the doctors would tell you to have. They wouldn't tell you to take alcohol to get out of your impoverished depression. So we've had the rise and rise of medicine, which helps us to cure things. I'm not blaming the doctors here. This is a social force. And at the same time, the rise and rise of many different diagnoses.
Yeah, I would like to ask you both to introduce specifically your memoirs, just a tiny little bit, in terms of what brought you to write Everyday Madness? And can you tell us a little bit about it? And I'll ask you for heavy light.
Sure.
Do you want me to start?
Go on, Lisa.
What brought me to write? My husband died, and I have to confess that I'm usually quite an ordinary person. I'm very boring, and I suddenly found myself experiencing things that I couldn't shake off, that I couldn't, if you'd call it depression, I couldn't leave it. If you'd call it things coming into my mind which had no place there, not even when I was in love, say, I couldn't get rid of them. And this state of mourning lasted for quite a long time and was obviously something that's been catalogued in many different ways, although not necessarily with all the individual marks and the kind of, I fear sometimes, the slightly brutal honesty that I brought to bear on myself, because it's not a pretty picture.
And you really mentioned the idea of anger as well. I mean, we're talking about the word madness, and I felt in your book there's this real mad, which I learned is an Americanism, the use of mad as angry, which is beside the point. But I'd love for you to talk about that state of anger.
I grew up with the word mad meaning the word angry, as well as the word meaning, insanity or variations on that. And what happened to me with this everyday madness, and I think this has been replicated in many other people, is that I was angry all the time. I was in a rage, and raging was something that was known from early what we would now call psychiatric medicine in the early asylums. And we now have very effective drugs to control it. So people who have mental illness, which goes into the equivalent of what were asylums, have drugs that help them not experience this state and indeed make them more placid. But when you're mourning, you don't have drugs, you're just angry, or at least I was. And I was angry about many things, and in the book I explore that and the reasons for it, which are good, reasonable reasons, rational reasons, but nonetheless the state you're in is not a rational state. And what happened with that, of course, is that at the time that this was going on in my own life, it was replicated in the social sphere by what you could call the English or the British madness, which was Brexit. And it doesn't matter whether you're for it or against it, but the country was mad. It was extremely angry. And people who had not disliked each other or hated each other before were suddenly at loggerheads. So that it felt as if there were madness everywhere, not only in me with the anger, but in the body politic. And I traced that and the way in which it then shifted and changed, and really, in my case, through time, which is a great healer of many things except life, and in my case having grandchildren, which was extraordinary, and some of the greatest loves of my life have been my grandchildren, and they teach you a lot about how human beings come into themselves, and babies are also slightly mad.
Yes. Or
Lovely.
are they? Or are they?
Sorry, I'm going on too long.
No.
Stop now.
Not at all. Mine was similar. It was a reasonable madness, or had reasonable causes. So I carry a diagnosis. I got one in France for cyclothymia, cyclothymie. Do you know it? So it's the easy, thin, nice end of bipolar. It's what you want if you're going to have that condition. It means that I'm never 5 sur 10. I'm always 6 or 4. So in the winter, because it's cyclical, je suis 4, 3, miserable, self-absorbed, hateful, self-hating, git. But in the summer, here we are. But I was in an awful situation, really. I was very unhappy in my relationship. Both me and my partner were ridden with unmet need. My dear ex, we had a son. I was lying, cheating, drinking too much, self-medicating, starting a new job, published 2 books at the same time. And I pushed myself to the point of, well, first of all, hypermania. which is you have great ideas and you talk fast. And then mania, you have great ideas, you talk fast, and you don't sleep. And then psychosis, which literally means sick of soul in the original Greek, but we understand to mean subject to delusions, so false beliefs. Now, I happen to believe that aliens are real, and it turns out I was right. Mr. Trump agrees with me. However, it is not the case that Kylie Minogue ever wanted to marry me, and I didn't work for MI6, but at the time, I did. And the beautiful thing about being mad was that my father no longer had leukemia. MI6 had faked those results. It was my job to defend my secret universe from everybody who was saying, you're crazy, you need to go and see a doctor. And keep lying, keep running, keep going faster. I was trying to bring about a revolution of consciousness and world peace. And I got very close, as you can tell. It was a great success. But eventually I was sectioned. This is about 2018-19. And I did 2 weeks in a psychiatric hospital in the north of England. They gave me quetiapine, and I know we're all here partly thanks to the wonders of drugs, on the first night, and on the second night, again. And on the third day, the people in the car park were no longer spies, they were builders. And I said, shit, you know, you're in a psychiatric hospital under Section 2 of the Mental Health Act, which is well, you can renew it, but it basically means you have very few rights. And my journey through psychiatry started then. So I got better very quickly, and then I had to fight the diagnosis thing, and they wanted to give me lithium, which I knew would be death to me, because if you come off lithium, it's very dangerous. You relapse, and I knew I'd come off. So I didn't want to do that. And they gave me other pills, a choice of pills. So I'm sitting there in my mate's Crocs with the haircut I've done myself, and a psychiatrist in a suit is with a BMW in the car park is saying, which one of these would you like to take? And I was like, well, why aren't you telling me? And the reason, of course, is that each drug affects each individual differently, and that we don't suffer from anything that anybody else suffers from. So you may be categorized as bipolar, but it means nothing if you put two of us side by side. We live completely different existences subject to different conditions. So obviously we're all struggling with categories, and a lot of us are taking psychiatric medication to relieve our physician's anxiety, and that's just true. I was talking to this wonderful man here about deprescribing. That is the way it goes. They err on the side of safety. In Britain, they're very scared to socially prescribe, and you have to be middle class, white, male, empowered and privileged to fight your way through the system significantly successfully. I'm a story of privilege. If I'd been black and working class, I could easily be dead by now. I would certainly be on heavy medication, because I've spent 10 years coming up with my own treatment plan and making programs about psychiatry and learning to understand it. The fact is, what we know about it runs so far ahead of what we do about it. The two are on different planets. But what they think is going to happen is that things like the schizophrenia diagnosis may be seen as yet another branch of psychosis. Language is all important in this. And the frightening thing, so I discovered open dialogue, which you may know about. It's more popular in France than in Britain, but it's essentially a group talking cure. It's group therapy for the whole network. Madness, as it were, is understood as a completely realistic and reasonable reaction to circumstance. Now, that ain't 100% true for everybody. Some of us are wired weird, but circumstances are the bit you can change. Can't change the wiring. You can douse the wiring, but you can't change it. So it's very hopeful in that in 50 years' time, psychiatric treatment will be entirely unlike it is now. But at the moment, it's a disaster, and the people that I work with, so I work with the NHS giving workshops on this stuff. When my mentor's son was really suicidally depressed, she didn't take him in. She didn't want him to have the NHS diagnosis. They sat on the sofa together for 3 months and cried it through. So it's not an ideal situation, but I learnt a huge amount, and I am optimistic about the future, but the medium term is pretty bleak, to be honest. We know, for example, that psilocybin, magic mushrooms, are extraordinarily effective for really psychotic depression. They rewire the default mode network. You can actually see it happening under a microscope. Something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor works like fertilizer on the dendrites of brain cells. And because your default mode network, which is how you think if you close your eyes, so your normal reality, which in Morge is pretty good, you can disrupt that. And you need to, if someone's thinking, I'm shit, I should kill myself because I'm shit, I should kill myself, psilocybin disrupts it, and it does it very quickly, whereas antidepressants, which just block the D2 receptor, take up to a month to work, and people die in that time. So the future is brighter, but the present is a struggle. And it's been one of the privileges of my life. I never intended to spend 7 years working on psychiatry, but I really have, and it's been an incredible journey. I'd recommend it to anyone who doesn't have a choice.
You have done an incredible job of answering all of my questions.
Damn.
I'm joking.
Let's talk about Trump.
No, I want to go back to one, you mentioned it earlier, and it relates also to something that Lisa was talking about. But in Heavy Light, you write that a mental breakdown is also a physical crisis. And that line really struck with me, and I'd love to hear you both talk about it more. The connection that is the physical connection and the mental connection, and that you cannot separate these two things.
Well, there are many, and I think it's always the case that the mental and the physical come together in some way, or at least the precipitating mechanisms. You know, we don't exist. The mind is a body, after all. It's part of a body, and our bodies feed our mind all the time. We have senses, and you know, without them, our minds would not exist. And senses are bodily, so you know, they do belong together. And I think one of the difficulties of medication has often been that it tends to take one and not the other into an equivalent, balanced effect. I mean, I say this as a woman too, because I think women throughout, this is not just psychiatric medicine, but all medicines are calibrated on male bodies, except for the pill. And realize there's no male pill yet, why not? But anyhow, and you know, what do you do with that if you're small or big? You know, children can't take the same drugs as adults, but women and men are not always the same either. So, you know, the calibration of drugs, whether they're for your mind or your body, is terribly important. Now I've forgotten the question. Am I getting towards answering it?
Yeah. A physical crisis as well as a mental one.
Yes.
Yeah, physical experience.
I mean, it's always physical, and the precipitating points are often physical too. And what you describe as your body being at the end of its tether, and you're feeding it with self-medication, effectively, is what so many people do all the time. I think one of the things that I would add to that, and Horatio, tell me if you don't agree with this, because some people do and some people don't, and I have a whole chapter about this in the book, is the way in which street drugs are sometimes, and you know, I haven't done the stats on this, but there seems to be a lot of coming together. Street drugs can end up triggering certain kinds of mental problems, and you end up on pharma drugs, or they, you know, they work against each other and together. And so if you don't take drugs and are an adolescent when things are it may be better for you. I don't, you know, it's a very hard thing to say because I'm not a Puritan, particularly about drug taking, although I am for myself, but not, you know, generally. But I do think there is a concatenation of these things, and it's a dangerous one. And the more drugs you take, the more drugs you need to take to get the stuff working, to do what it's meant to do, and it doesn't always.
You definitely address this in Heavy Light. I'd love to hear you speak about it.
I've definitely addressed street drugs for decades. I'm the 90s generation. We grew up on marijuana. The problem is we also suffered from British prohibition. So if you go to Holland, Dutch children aren't knocked sideways by cannabis, whereas British children are, because A, it's prohibited, and B, what they can get is skunk. And if you talk to psychiatrists in London, they will say that up to 70% of their young people with psychosis is caused by bad drugs policy. So that is a disaster. And you're right about it being a physical crisis. It's also been explained to me as a spiritual crisis. I know people, there's a story of a man in West Africa who was revered in his tribe, amongst his people, and he married a girl from Southampton who came to the Gambia to visit. And they went back to Southampton, and very soon he was in the cells, and very soon he was dead. And the reason was, in his society, being a voice hearer, as some people who've been branded schizophrenic think of themselves, was seen as respectable, indeed admirable. And in Southampton, it got him killed. There's a lot of misoverlap, and we know, for example, that rates of psychosis are much better. Recovery from psychosis is much better in the developing world because of strong family networks, a lack of fear, and a feeling of social support. We also know that as countries westernize in their medical practices, like Nigeria, for example, the rates get worse as they adopt our Anglo-Saxon model of psychiatric diagnosis and drugs. In fact, Lisa almost, I don't know, but the DSM-5, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which underpins American psychiatry, was drawn up by American psychiatrists. So
psychotherapists, psychologists,
well, psychiatrists, actually, and
they're called psychiatrists in America, but they aren't necessarily.
But in the end, they prescribe towards their speciality. So Lisa could have been diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder if she was unhappy sufficiently long time,
or
which was just outrageous
disorder,
nonsense.
Or any of those things. Again, I chart the history of the growth and growth and growth of the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, and the way in which they did it, which is by committee. And you know what happens in committees? I've chaired a lot of them. One side wins out over another, but not necessarily because of a factual base, but in terms of who's in the room and who speaks better or louder. And it's not necessarily a way of arriving at a perfect description of something. And in any case, those descriptions, if you follow them, if you're actually somebody who works in the field, don't work, or they don't work well enough.
No,
because you can tick any boxes.
Placebo, actually. We haven't had a massive jump forward in psychiatric drugs since about 1958, when they discovered chlorpromazine, and that was a game changer. Suddenly, the asylums of America and the West could be emptied with people who could now function in society. I am very pro-medication. It has saved thousands and thousands of lives, millions, but it has to be correctly administered. It really works best in crisis. We know, thanks to Martin Harrow's study, for example, at the University of Chicago, that over 20 years, if you get diagnosed with bipolar or, as it was, manic depression, you're better off not taking lithium over 20 years if you can be got through those crises, if the networks are there for you. But there was a thing in Britain called care in the community, where they emptied the psychiatric hospitals and pushed everybody out into the community. The problem was the care wasn't there, and nor was the community, really. So suddenly people were on the streets. And we have a ludicrous system of readmission at the moment. So if you get into a mental hospital, it's very difficult to get in. You've got to have a very, very high bar now because the places are so expensive. Once you get in, and there's a phrase you have to use, which is significant risk of immediate harm to self or others. If nobody says that, you're not getting in. But you're likely to be out again in a week or 2 or 3 weeks or however long, and then you'll be back in. And we're not providing therapy, not in any realistic way, and that we know is the answer. So what they get is something called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is a tool to help you deal with situations. But as somebody said to me, there's no point telling me how to behave tomorrow if you don't deal with what my father did to me when I was 10. And he was in the psychiatric hospital with me. He'll have been back in since. Our system fails in every way. The Labour government, which take a lot of stick, at least in Britain, have put money into mental health. Wales, where I'm from, we're doing an entirely new model of one-stop crisis centre. In Finland, where young doctors designed the Finnish medical system from the ground up at the invitation of the government, you do have these one-stop centres which do everything. And that will work. Because the thing that kills people is the waiting lists, actually, and when you get there, ineffective treatment. But if we can have, so what we have in Wales is a therapist, a psychiatrist, and an emergency doctor, and a pharmacist. Mental health pharmacy is a very complicated and important area, and it really works. But often doctors aren't listening to mental health pharmacists who spend their time deprescribing. So we will get there. Canada has this system. Finland, they invented open dialogue. If any of you have friends or relatives in crisis, things to remember are you must get them psychiatric medication in crisis, like it really does work, but you don't want it for a long time if possible. And second, look for open dialogue, talking therapy, analytical therapy, because at the moment our entire system is geared to treating symptoms. And what you've got to get to is causes, and that means therapy.
Yeah, Freud always said you can always juggle symptoms. I can remove a patient's symptom very, very quickly, but it comes up somewhere else. And I think that's the problem with symptomatology. But Switzerland, je vous dis ça peut-être en français, mais c'est une des bases de toute la psychiatrie du XXe siècle, and the psychotherapies. I mean, obviously, you had Bleuler here at the Bergholze. You had this extraordinary hospital where quite a lot of Americans were treated, and at the Bergholze, all the Americans of the period came to study. Freud was in constant communication with Bleuler. Jung was there. Prangin, I think, is around. I don't know where Prangin is compared to where we are. Maybe somebody could tell me. So these beautiful hills became clinics.
Yeah.
And there were an awful lot of patients here, and I can see why they came here, because it's so wonderful.
So can I. I feel sane, and I have done since I arrived. Yes, psychiatric drugs give you a firm place to stand. And then you need to make those changes then. And obviously the privilege, it's much easier to do it. If you have money, you can make changes. Maybe you leave your partner, maybe you leave your job. Something changes and it doesn't come back so severely. And of course, access, as we know, working class people in Britain, according to a survey, don't think that nature or culture are for them. We failed them that badly. You know, it's a middle class thing. And you see it changing, but it's true. We have got ghettos of poverty and fear, where of course
Do you
rates
think
are very high.
chocolate would help?
Chocolate will always
If I were
help.
given help.
Yeah, anything.
I was really struck in the memoir about how difficult it was to actually get you sectioned, which you mentioned earlier. And I would love to hear you both talk about that in the sense, because you mention that it was a privilege. You were articulate, you were a white male, and it was very difficult for the people around you trying very hard to get you care.
Yeah. Well, I'm very plausible.
What's that?
I'm plausible.
Yeah.
I deal with authority naturally. You know, I'm not scared of the police or doctors. And when you say you're a reporter, they tend to be a bit more scared of you. But the whole point of the system is to keep people out. That is exactly right. Yeah, my dear partner, and they kept saying, well, it's alcohol and drugs, and I was saying, it's alcohol and drugs. I ran my car off of the road in the end. I mean, I jumped out first. But I had to be pretty mad to get it, and it was dangerous, actually.
And is that still the case? Would that still be the case for a woman in a similar situation? I think that was the thing I was the most curious about.
Yes, it would be. It is very difficult to get your loved one care.
It's
That
very
is
difficult,
correct.
unless you can pay.
Yeah.
And there's a private sector too, and the private sector is expensive, but it's also there. Not in huge array, but it's there. I don't know what it's like in the north of England, but certainly in London.
No, there's just, the queues are enormous.
Yeah.
Even if you've got money.
Yeah. And all the asylums have been effectively closed down. I mean, what used to be called in the 19th century asylums, and it began the century as very beneficent institutions.
Yes.
Where people basically had a structure to their lives and got on with their illness as they gardened or played or danced or whatever.
Which has wonderful consequences.
But then deteriorated when they got overcrowded and began to have heads who were completely mad themselves in terms of what they thought helped patients. And there are quite a few cases in Mad, Bad and Sad where the doctors are obviously berserk and are instituting practices which are meant to be practices of care, which in fact are practices of destruction and of driving people mad. I mean, pulling teeth out, feeding people with drugs which have nothing to do with anything. I mean, it did get slightly better at some points when the institutions were closed down and you were meant to have care in the community. But as you say, that was really a cost-saving exercise, not a beneficent exercise.
Was always practiced on women. Always. In the history of American psychiatry, the treatment of women is absolutely invidious under minorities. And they noticed in the old asylums that the poor people had to work, and they would recover better than the rich who just sat there staring out the window being crazy. I mean, gardening, we know, really helps.
That's not true of all the asylums, but
no,
yes.
but it was something that was a noted effect.
Yeah.
The
class system pervades everything.
You mentioned a very particular case in the Rebels chapter in Mad, Bad and Sad that was really astounding to me, but a woman who, between 1950 and 1988, or even later, she was institutionalized for something like 5 decades. And I'll invite you to talk about
she
her.
just went through different forms of treatment as they became, as either the heads of the institution changed very late in her stay, or there were new fashions like insulin treatment or shock therapy, or in her case as well, teeth pulling, because it was meant to be a site where infection built up, and that was bad for the brain, according to this particular doctor. And so it went on, and of course, people become institutionalized in institutions, so they can't live outside them. I sometimes, in my more depressed about society moments, think that really, if it weren't for the so-called child abuse and everything else, one should bring back convents and monasteries, because the kind of ordered, structured existence that went on within them actually helps a lot of people to get through and to
like
retain.
Van Gogh in Saint-Denis.
Yeah, and it makes it's safe, it's secure.
Yes.
And it provides you with order.
Yes.
God maybe, but that's almost a plus.
Yes. Being away from your family can be very healing.
Yeah.
Be taken out of the context.
Families can be very toxic institutions.
Yeah.
I'd like to shift us a tiny little bit to talking about the writing of it. You are both writers. You have large, expansive bodies of work. And I'd like to ask you, what was it like to write about these very personal experiences? Was it part of the healing? And at what point were you able to write about it?
You want to go first? You want me to
Sure. I started on the 3rd day in the mental institution. I'm part of a very blessed generation of Welsh and English writers. We have readers, and we've been supported and reviewed, and they're my friends and rivals, and I thought, none of them is in here. None of them has got this story. My God. And so I immediately started keeping a diary, and that forms the core of the book. And then, of course, I come out. My publisher says, I want this. Tell us this story. Because the thing was, I went crazy, but I can rationally remember all of it. So then lockdown came, and I sat down in the mornings on the step in Yorkshire and wrote 1,000 to 2,000 words a day. And my little boy would say, have you finished, Daddy? And we would go swimming. It was fabulous. And of course, I'm engaged in the reconstruction of identity. That was what I was doing. The minute I picked up the pen, I ceased to be a loony, at least in my estimation, and became a writer who was embedded with loonies. And ever since then, I mean, this for me clearly is public therapy. I'm being revalidated and told that I'm sane and on top of things and have something to say. So it was a wonderfully healing experience. The worst bit of it is destruction, fear and misery I put my family through, and the wait on services. I mean, the police had to come a few times, ambulances, doctors, all this kind of thing, but the book is written to pay tribute to them and to explain to anybody else who gets in that position how everything works, what the doctor's thinking, what the ambulance crew are thinking, how it works. And I went back and interviewed everybody with whom I had contact, from my nurse to the woman who sectioned me. So it was a wonderful experience, and it really was like being in All the President's Men. It was like being Dustin Hoffman with the Watergate crisis, because I suddenly realized that psychiatry and psychotherapy disagree about everything. There's a schism right through our entire understanding of mental health. And for a journalist, that was just like catnip. I could not believe it. So there's the excitement of that was very much part of it. It was really fascinating.
And I wanted to ask you, just before I let you speak, Lisa, I wanted to ask you something that is so apparent in Heavy Light. We were talking about anger earlier, and there is very little anger in that book. Although the first section, there's a palpable sense of stress and the misery that you are aware that you are inflicting. On some level, you are aware that you're inflicting this on your family.
Daddy's crazy is a bad thing for a household.
But the people that you encounter from the beginning, the journey, everyone who got you into the institution and worked with you afterwards, they are portrayed as so supremely kind.
They are.
And
they're heroes.
It's so striking.
Yes, good. I'm glad you felt that. Thank you. It was absolutely to pay tribute. I mean, they are the catchers in the rye. And to become a mental health nurse in Britain right now is a hell of a choice, because the salary ain't great, the support ain't great, it's really frightening. I've got a friend who does it, he's a support worker, punched in the face the other day. The nurse said to him, watch that one, don't turn your back on that one, as she left. The other person, that was the handover. One person off sick means the whole ward is vulnerable to somebody having a breakdown, there's not enough staff. It's a very frightening environment, it can be for the staff themselves and for the patients. Often it's the worst possible place. So when I work with social workers who section people, because under our system a doctor can't section you, so to section is to detain against your will. Only a social worker can do that, which is important, because doctors are a bit different from the rest of us. They have to be, they have to kill us or save us. Social workers are of us, but I know what you mean, but that feeling of society cannot handle you anymore. But to go into work voluntarily every day and face that is magnificent. They are the catchers in the rye, Holden Caulfield's dream. They're stopping the children running off the cliff, and we're all the children. So it's very important that brilliant people go into politics and also into mental health.
You write about them beautifully.
Thank you.
Lisa.
Remind me of the question. How did I write these things? Well,
yes.
How was the experience of writing it? Did it help? Did it hinder? Was it hard?
So I've written about, I guess what we now, mental illness, madness, the farther reaches of everyday life, if you like, in my fiction before. I've also done a lot of work with the talking therapies, and I spent a 2-year stint being a so-called writer in residence in a neurological laboratory, because I wanted to see the hard edge of things as they were coming into being in a memory lab. My mother had Alzheimer's, which is other kind of madness we haven't mentioned and is pretty widespread these days because we all live so long. Over 80, any minute now, here I come. While I still remember how I started, I will tell you. So I've done all that. The memoir, Everyday Madness, and it is a kind of memoir as well as an essay, or as the French would say, an essai, grew out of a very specific kind of writing which I had done in a book called Losing the Dead, which was actually a family memoir. I'm not so good at writing about me. I'm very good at charting my place within everything else. And this was within the family, and I had not a particularly difficult family, but they had been through the war on the hard line, and my childhood was fairly checkered, and it was very interesting to try and reconstruct that, and to do it for my mother, who was at that point losing her mind. So Losing the Dead was that story. And I wrote Everyday Madness, as I say, after the experience, my husband dying and mourning, and the country going crazy. And the country was still going crazy when I was writing it, but I was quite a lot better. And so writing always helps. Writing helps a lot of things because you're concentrated, you're in a state of semi-trance, and it's, for me, a very pleasurable process. I love writing. I don't do so much of it now because it hurts my body, hurts my back a lot. But the writing of it came very much as a charting of an experience. And I could see the country falling apart in all kinds of small ways because I was so attuned to rage. I was so attuned to it. I found it. I was constantly, people were, beating me up in the car or in the tube or whatever, and kind of surprised at this because I'm a very pacific person normally. I keep saying, using that word Pacific, I mean, kindly, ordinary, well-tempered.
Rage weather. Like J.G. Ballard land.
Yeah. J.G. Ballard was another case.
Right, he was another case.
Is there a part of your writing or your writing process, I ask this to both of you, that pushes you towards madness? And is there a part of the writing process that pulls you back towards sanity?
Well, I'm not sure what madness means in that context. If you mean losing your everyday bearings, then much of writing is like that. Because you're usually alone in one way or another, whether you're in a cafe doing it like that, or you're in your study or whatever, or in a place like this where, wow, what a place to write. But you're away from the other kinds of needs of everyday life, or you try to be. And so you're in a different state. Now, whether you want to call that state mad, which some people have or not, is...
And I think it's much of what we're talking about this weekend.
Yeah. You know, during the Romantic period, everybody thought the writers themselves thought they had a touch of madness, and it was considered a good thing. It was a wildness. It was a way of being revolutionary. It was a way of unearthing the status quo. In the early 20th century, in Switzerland, at the turn of the 19th, people would go to seances and hear the dead speak while they were in a social group through the auspices of a medium. And you know, some of the best psychiatrists in Switzerland went through that, and it was just their way of studying the mind, putting themselves into its furthest reaches. I mean, Jung, we know, had psychoses of various kinds. Freud was depressive, and wouldn't have written anything if he didn't think he was a little bit crazy. Bleuler was anti-alcohol because he knew it made people crazy. So they're all, you know, it's kind of there. When you're writing, yes, and how do you stay away from it? Well, I'm a very formal writer. I'm not a wild writer. I like form, and form helps to contain me. And, you know, when I said form of convents or seminaries or, you know, walls of a university, all these places that have structure, I think, are very important to people. And one of the difficulties that people have when they work alone with their AIs or with their algorithms or whatever is that the structure is something they have to provide themselves. And I think that's very hard, particularly for children and adolescents. And I worry about my grandchildren because of that, because there is nowhere within their everyday encounters with this either gaming world or you know, the world of algorithms are so deeply rational that they're irrational and quite mad of their own, as we can see by some of the giants in the industry. And you don't have bodies when you're doing all of that. And bodies are a very important way to maintain sanity, if we like it. I like it.
I like it. I like this version of it. Well, I grew up understanding that writing was basically romanticism, and therefore one should, like Rambo, seek the systematic derangement of the senses. I thought that was the point. You know, child of the 60s generation, the beats, all of that. So gleefully set about deranging the senses. Turns out, I mean, the great writer Jeff Young, and I really would advise you read this if you read English with Felicity, is a book called Wild Twin. He's one of our better writers at the moment. He's in his late 60s and has just started. He's a playwright, and but they're wonderful books. They're memoirs. It's about being in Amsterdam in the 70s and 80s on the streets. And Jeff's the real thing. And he thinks that writers are shamanic and that the role is to disrupt, therefore to bring madness to society and make trouble. I was talking with Charlotte Dufour earlier on. You know, you want to be the ones that they shoot. You know, if Stalin shoots you, you're doing a good job. So how does this translate into writing versus madness? Well, the great Jeanette Winterson, who's my colleague at the University of Manchester, Jeanette had a full-on psychotic breakdown as well. She said, I don't know how you managed to do it in public. She said, I went off into the country. And she realized that her madness wanted to be written out as a book. And so she did it. And she writes, so she wrote Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, but the one I teach every year is the non-fiction in a parallel piece called Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal. And in Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal, Janet makes the point that writing is exactly the opposite of madness. It is what we do to keep madness at bay. And that is certainly the case for me. So as a travel writer, I mean, I'm one of the few people you'd like to meet who's literally had his canoe bitten in half by a hippo. A degree of madness on the journey is what we go to find. but it's the writing is the sane part, you know. It really is. It's the one place where we can impose an order on experience which comes from our own morality and decision-making, rather than the impositions of everybody else. So, you know, Flaubert, as you know, said, live like a bourgeoisie, like you guys, so you can write like a revolutionary, like you guys. And I think that there's a balance in there somewhere. But I do think that writers have become very PR-ified, very like accountants. If you want to meet real artists who like live art and represent it and are attractive to young people going into it, rather than a guy in a suit, you might look at a rock band, for example. You know, and artists, visual artists, they seem to have a degree of freedom that writing, because we get drawn into the media culture, currently lacks. And it's difficult to see really great books coming out of my generation at the moment that will last for 1,000 years. Not really great writers. There's plenty of us there, but we're still working towards a really knockout poet or a really knockout novelist. I do think, I mean, the talent's there, but we're quite conservative and quite constrained by consensual reality, which Jeff Young isn't.
So we have time for questions. Yes, please. I think there'll be a micro. And I have more questions if we don't, but I liked.
Oui, Horatio, j'ai beaucoup apprécié nos discussions.
Horatio, I particularly appreciated our discussion yesterday evening and this morning, but there are things that you say that I can't let you say. You said drugs are there to deal with the crisis. I can't let you say that. Bipolarity is a disease where changes occur very fast, sometimes in a half hour. I remember a colleague who's a psychiatrist who was bipolar. At 11, she called me up to give me an appointment at 4, and at 3, she'd hung herself from a tree on a golf course. And I'm sure that half an hour before, she had no idea she was going to commit suicide. The change occurred very fast. She quit her treatment. It's as if a diabetic were saying, I've got high blood pressure, I took insulin, my blood sugar is normal, I'll quit. It's the same thing. Bipolar people, you might have cyclothymia. But if you're truly bipolar, just like Philippe Amod, whom we've heard earlier, if you quit your treatment, it's extremely dangerous. If you quit your treatment, you could commit suicide all of a sudden, lose your job, sell your apartment. And so for schizophrenics, it's the same thing. They can undergo dramatic breakdowns. Lisa, I admire your work, but when you say that children should be sent to Catholic convents, as a Frenchman, I can't agree with that.
We thank you for your comment. And is there a question? Anyone?
I would just like to answer about the
Madame.
convents. Just say something about that. It was a metaphorical use of them, because I think they're just institutions that provide structure, and we haven't got any of those anymore.
Okay, there was a hand up.
Yep, got it.
Please, Jenny.
Yes, I'm going to make sure I try and phrase this as a question.
As a question.
But what I find myself thinking about, and I'm hearing slightly different balance in the views about what it means to have money in these crises. How much does that protect you? And are there other forms of protection that have to do with art, family, being supportive, acceptance? I mean, it was a brilliant example about you can be in Gambia, be schizophrenic, and have a validation around that having power and value, whereas in a different context, you're wiped out by that same condition. And I wanted to just mention that I have 2 friends who have both been diagnosed with bipolar years and years ago. One comes from a very wealthy family in the United States. Both live in Connecticut. The other came from a very working class family. And I have to say, in the long run, I made the mistake of trying to tell the wealthy female friend how fortunate she was over the years, only to realize that, you know, her situation had been incredibly difficult for her. And, you know, if you're depressed and you can't get out of bed and your family are going to say, what will people think? You know, that's hard. Versus this other guy who has now won a scholarship to study and has been doing his art. And they both had a difficult time. But I think maybe part of the journey for you both is having certain conception or preconceptions about money and support and all of this challenged around mental health, if that makes any sense. Is that the case? And I would direct that to both of you.
I mean, the statistics do show that the outcomes for poor people are much worse. But you're absolutely right. On an individual basis, there aren't any rules of thumb in a thing which is, you know, drives us all towards categorization and kind of mass classification and mass treatment. Whereas in fact, everyone is as individual as the sea on a different day. I absolutely take that point. And in a decent mental health system, you've all got a fighting chance. And you're absolutely right. They say I mean, I'm not saying anything about your friend, but they say that the very rich, pop stars, and the poor get the worst psychiatric treatment because the very rich will get referred to, you know, so-and-so who's supposed to be good by word of mouth. And we've seen that. If you've seen the Stephen Fry documentary, it's a terrible indictment of our system, which is held up as a really good example. Fry is very open about his bipolar, and he goes to this quack who completely medicates him and keeps medicating, and Fry gets worse and worse, and you just think, for Christ's sake, somebody tries something else on this. But of course, it's Harley Street, and therefore it's where you want to go, because you can afford it. Yeah, you want to be very unlucky with that, yeah.
Yes, I mean, just to say one more thing about this, it's very often the case that the families are effectively the forces that drive particularly young people into illness, whether it's the kind that needs an analyst or a therapist or the kind that might need more extreme care, if you like. And I would never presume that because somebody was rich or richer or middle class, they would have different care. But in Britain at the moment, the kind of crisis that has come after COVID with the young is one which does fall more heavily on the poor.
Because it is also a crisis of value, of ambition, of national direction, of what the system is.
It's also a crisis of how you conceive of the human being.
Yes, what we're for.
And, you know, there's different kinds of languages that about.
Yes, and I love that about the so-called Gen Z. They refuse to write male or female. Good for you. They refuse to go to work on Mondays or Fridays. Well done. You know, I admire that tremendously. They won't read email. Sod that. Yeah, and you know, my generation, you've seen the worst of us, basically, Boris sodding Johnson, etc. But we're not done yet. And what the students promise I make them is we will wipe out these old systems of nonsense and hand you a level playing field. Still working on it.
But we were the same.
Yes, sure, but you know, it's all to play for now, isn't it? Because the consequences of societal failure are enormous, and the possibilities of societal success are infinite.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for
Thank
coming
you.
and
Thank you.
sharing
You were
and
wonderful.
discussing.
And thank Alia and Star for their
Yes,
translation.
thank our